All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 or Web Development Technologies class, I've been going through a series of presentations based on the Mozilla Developer Network or MDN series of articles on learning web development, getting started with the web. And there are 9 parts in this: the overview, installing basic software, what will your website look like, dealing with files, HTML basics, and CSS basics. Those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 I've already covered. And I'm now going to go into JavaScript Basics, which I do not believe I'll be able to do in just one lecture. It'll probably take at least 2. Then we'll go into publishing your website and how the web works. And after we get done with this series right here, we'll jump into the HTML and look at that in a lot more depth and breadth of coverage. And the way I plan on presenting that to you, because you can see it's broken up into different areas, is I am going to build a complete site based on what we had been talking about before. So let's jump back into JavaScript Basics. So whereas when we started with HTML, which allowed us to add the content to our web page, then we looked at CSS, which allowed us to add some aesthetics, colors, etc. Now we're going into JavaScript. JavaScript is a full-fledged programming language. All right. In other words, unlike the CSS and the HTML we've talked about previously, here you can do things like looping, if statements, etc. Probably won't get into much of that right now, but later we will. Now, JavaScript used to be known as a client-side programming language, which meant that in a class like the one we're in now, the AWD 1000 class, which basically does talk a lot about client-side development, it was the language of choice, and it still is. But JavaScript today is also used on the server side. They mention right here that it adds interactivity to a website. And they give you some examples. I'm not going to go over any of those. All right. It is dynamic. It allows us to have interactivity. All right. Now, one thing about this, I put in a very simple example that I actually pulled right from the web here on displaying the date and time. So when you look down here, now it's when I say it's interactive, it is, but you have to keep refreshing the page in its current format. So right now, it's 5/11/2021 and it's almost 1:30 p.m. You'll notice it says 1:29:19 and the clock's not ticking, but if I refresh, it's now been updated. All right, and we'll talk about how you can add things to basically get what you want to have in there. We will be getting into all this stuff. So it says JavaScript is versatile and beginner friendly. It is versatile, and it is beginner friendly in that there are certain things that you probably should do when you write JavaScript programs, but if you forget to do them, by and large, JavaScript knows what you mean, even if you don't do them. So it's a very forgiving language. I have likened it to the following. All right. For many years, I've been trying to learn to play guitar, and I've been a little more serious about it in the last couple months. I'm still not good, but I'm still at best a rank amateur or a beginner. But the point is, I play an acoustic guitar, and if I make a mistake, everybody knows about it. So if I'm playing in front of other people and I hit a sour note, usually it's not too bad. I mean, I shouldn't say that, just the opposite. Usually it's pretty bad because people can tell. On the other hand, if I was using an electric guitar and I had an amp with it and the amp was turned up loud enough, even if I wasn't that good, it probably would sound a lot better than it probably would be. All right. So it says there JavaScript is a relatively compact language, but it's very flexible. And what I think you learn in this class for lack of better words, is probably the 20-80 rule. And if you've never heard that, you learn the 20% of JavaScript that, at least on the client side in this class, that you're going to use 80% of the time. The course you take at Rankin Technical College in the third semester, the AWD 1112, and it's called like Web-Driven Database Development or something like that. I don't remember. But that's JavaScript on the server side. Okay. All right. It says developers have written a variety of tools on top of the core JavaScript language. Things like APIs, which we don't look at much in here. If we have time, we will. But that's more in the third semester class. So there are browser-based APIs. There are third-party APIs. Twitter and Facebook are examples. And there's frameworks and libraries that you can use with this. All right. As it says, this is a light introduction to JavaScript. And that's all it's really meant to be. It says if you want more, you can go to the Mozilla Developer Network's JavaScript learning area. So if I were to bring that up, that's all about JavaScript. We're going to cover the stuff that's in here later. Notice that's what's in here. All right. So if a lot of it doesn't make a boatload of sense right now, I really and truly wouldn't let that bother you. All right. So they give an example, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the example that they give. It's a little bit, believe it or not, I think at least, it's a little bit complex of an example. All right. But they put it in here. So let's see. Instead of going through that, let me look at the example with you of the one that I put in, the one in here. So now notice, if I refresh again, it's now 1:33 and 26 seconds. All right, so let's just look at that example. It's, again, fairly simplistic. It may not seem to be simplistic. And as always, it's simplistic to somebody who's been working on it for a while. But if you haven't, it's really not. So let's just take a look at it from out here. So display time, date and time using JavaScript on the client, which is what we're doing. First, we need to define where the date and time should be shown on the page. So this span, this says basically I want an empty area which is going to say on it date, time, and then just an empty area where I'm going to put the date and time. So notice date / time : What is that? That thing that you see here, this paragraph that starts with date, time, that is this. What we're putting in here, what we're putting right there, that's what the contents of the span are. It's just an area where we want to put something. All right. And we could put it like this, or we could have put it into two different paragraphs. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. The key stuff is what's in here. And that is what's in there. Now, just like we learned with CSS, cascading style sheets, there were 3 different ways that we could put in CSS. And that is, we could put in CSS externally, where we put it in its own file. We could put it in internally, where we use style tags and put it in at the top of or bottom or someplace in our head section. Or we could use inline, which is the worst way of doing things. That's, if you remember, I said in that one sentence that said this is a paragraph, I made the T a lot bigger. Well, in much the same way, when you are creating JavaScript, you can put your JavaScript in an external file. All right. You can put it in internally, where you put it in at either the top or the bottom of your program, or you can do it again inline, where you put it in where you need it. And that's kind of what they've done here. If you notice at what's in blue right here, all right, and I'll get it out of blue, but if you notice it right there, what they're saying is the JavaScript goes in between what are called script tags. and there must be a closing script tag, regardless of how you put this stuff in. There must be a closing script tag. All right. So what we're doing right here, and again, I don't expect this to totally make sense to you, is the word var means we're creating a variable. The variable is going to be called DT. DT is short for date time because that's basically what we have. And we are creating what's called there a new date object. By default, that date object is designed to show us the date and the time. And then we're saying what I want you to do is I want you to go up to that span that was called date time, and I want you to take that span. There's nothing in it right now. Notice there's nothing there. And I want you to put in the current date and time, put it in there. So that will be the inner HTML. That's what's going to go in there. Now, again, that may make no sense to you whatsoever, and it's totally, totally fine. They've got their own example in here. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. I don't know. All right. But jumping down, they want to give you a crash course in the JavaScript programming language. All right, let's talk variables. And by the time we get down to comments, we might even get that in. But by the time we get into here, we'll be ready to call this first part a wrap. So variables are containers. They're actually a location in memory, in the computer's memory, whose contents can vary. Vary as in variables. Now, when I showed you this example, we had the word var in there. That's old school. You shouldn't use the word var anymore. Today, you should use the word let. There are a lot of reasons for using the word let, and it has to do with things like hoisting and a few other things that we'll get to at a later time. For now, when you create a new variable, you just use the word let followed by the name of the variable. Now, when you create a new variable, you can give it a value too. So you could have said here, let my variable equals 27, or let my variable equal double quote Jeff double quote, or let my variable equal true, or whatever. All right, so what they have here, it's let followed by the name of the variable. Now, if you remember earlier, I told you that JavaScript was a very forgiving language. If you forget to put that semicolon at the end of the line, basically one is put in there, like inferred, like it's put in there by JavaScript. It's still a good idea, I think, to put it in. There are all sorts of different things. Notice there's even a thing in here under your guide to semicolons in JavaScript. Okay. You can name a variable almost anything you want. There are restrictions. It can't be the same name as a reserved word in JavaScript, and we'll get into reserved words later. It can't have spaces in it. It must start with a letter or a $sign or an underscore. It is case sensitive. So as they say there, my variable with a capital V is not the same as my variable with a lowercase v. This is something worth taking a look at. The differences between var and let. Var, again, is old school, and it allowed you to be really, really, really sloppy with your programming. Using let allows you to be less sloppy, but you become a better programmer because of it. As mentioned before, when you create the variable, this right here, that's called a variable declaration. You're declaring a variable named myVariable. This is initializing that variable to a value. So declaring a variable, initializing a variable. You can do both in one line. So this part is the declaration, and this part is the initialization. All right, you can do it in one line, or you can do it in multiple lines. That's what they're saying here. Now, one thing about JavaScript, good, bad, or indifferent, is it doesn't have that many variable types. If you make something a string, you have to put it in either single quotes as shown here, or you can use double quotes. I prefer to use double quotes because in many programming languages, when you want to create a string, it must be in double quotes. It can't be in double or single quotes. A string is a sequence of characters. Now, if I would have said right here, let my variable equals, they've got quote Bob quote. Let's say I put in there quote 56 quote. That's not the number then 56. It's the string. It's not the number 56. It's the string 56 with no numerical value to it whatsoever. If I want something to have a numerical value, I don't use single or double quotes with it, as you can see in that second example where they said let my variable equal 10. The third type there is a Boolean. Booleans are true false. Now it doesn't show it here, but often Boolean variables start with the word is married, is union, type of thing. An array is, whereas all these two, and typically really this one too, these are pretty much all what are referred to as elementary data items. This is a data structure. What's the difference? Well, this is the way I typically explain it to my class. And that is, imagine it's the first day of class and you all walk in there, and let's say it's a really big class at a major college or major university, and there's 500 people in a lecture hall. And a teaching assistant comes in and says, the teacher's going to be a little late. Here's a Lego for you to play with. And each one of you get a Lego. Those Legos are collectively simple data items or elementary data items like these two especially. But class is supposed to start, the instructor's not there, it's 10 minutes, it's 15 minutes, and you don't know whether to leave or not, but you start talking to the person next to you and you're like, hey, I've got a Lego, you've got a Lego, let's put them together. And pretty soon you put all the Legos together in the class and you build a rocket, let's say. Well, what you did was you took some elementary data items and you put them together into a data structure. And an array is a type of data structure. It allows you to store multiple values under a single name. Another way of looking at it is like when I moved to Missouri, I lived for a couple of years, actually a year, I think, in an apartment. And it was an 8-unit apartment. Now, this wasn't my address, but imagine my address was 123 Main Street. So if somebody had sent something to Jeff Scott at 123 Main Street, and if I was in apartment 1, and they put apartment 1, it would probably get to me. Probably if they just put Jeff Scott 123 Main Street, it would have gotten to me as well. But for those mailboxes, there were 8 mailboxes that were collectively put together as one big mailbox, and it had 8 slots in it. It's kind of like what an array is. And an object is kind of a wild card of a thing because it can hold just about anything. Again, we're going to hit on these in much more depth and breadth of coverage. All right. Comments, just like you did inside of a CSS file, you can use a / for comments and end it with a //. That's typically done for a multi-line comment. Or if you use // everything that comes after that to the right of the //, the rest of that line is a comment. Comments are extra things that you put in code. They're ignored by the browser. So you can put things in there, notes, to-dos, or whatever it is you want to put in there. All right, let's stop right here and we'll go into operators in just a bit.